Aspiring fit pros, personal trainers, welcome to our comprehensive NASM 7th edition study guide. You guys can see, boom, on the screen right now, I have a shot of our actual detailed study guide, which you guys can gain access to if you haven't already. Check out the link in the description below and feel free to download that, go along with me. So if you can get access to that and then also follow along in this video, that would be ideal because you can click out to the additional links I'm gonna refer to. But if not, what we're gonna do inside this video is we're gonna spend some time literally going through everything, chapter by chapter, the most important concepts inside of each chapter that you need to know to pass the NASM exam. I know because I retake the exam on a regular basis to see how they're asking questions, and we created this resource for the students that we work with. You guys can see I'm actually rocking and rolling here in the gym right now where we run our in-person NASM courses. We also work virtually like we are right now with students, but we created this super detailed study guide for them, and we just decided, hey, you know what? We know more and more people struggle with the process. NASM, right? You pick up this major, massive textbook, you dive in, it's 300 pages, and most people, like yourself, you're watching this video probably because you're just looking for some additional resources, how to cut through it all. And that's what we want to do inside this video, because there is a ton of gold inside of here, but I can tell you as a personal trainer who's been working in this environment with clients for 16 plus years, it's not all essential, and it's not all essential right now based on where you're at. So we're gonna try to make sure you know what to study, you know what to focus on inside of each chapter, and we're gonna do that by literally going bit by bit, chapter by chapter. So this is probably one of our longer videos. So stay with me on this, and if you're really just looking for content inside of a specific chapter, feel free, you can see the timestamps in the description of this video below as well, and you can just skip to the areas that you might be most interested in. All right, but once you guys get access to and you guys download the study guide, we got a little intro in there. The one thing I want you, as we go through this, I want you to take a look at and refer back to is this little CPT blueprint. And this is the fact that I'm gonna try to highlight this as we're going through these chapters, is not every chapter is created equal, right? When NASM created the curriculum and the OPT model, like these other components of curriculum have been consistent for a while, other things tend to shift and change, right? How much they want you to know about the scope of practice, about the, essentially professional development inside the industry. So there's a lot of great stuff. Not all of it is gonna be as heavily weighed on the exam. I'm gonna try to point you guys towards the stuff that, like, hey, no doubt from someone who retakes the exam like every year, this is the stuff they're gonna be asking you so that you can get on to all the real learning that happens when you're actually working with clients. All right, so that's the good stuff, but let's jump right into some of the actual content. You guys can see inside, if you guys do download this study guide, which you should, is the additional yellow links that you guys see in here, like refer to here, video link here. I'm not gonna go through those in these video because it would mess up my screen share, but these will link you out to additional detailed videos. So for some of the stuff I'm gonna go through pretty quickly in this video, because I just wanna try to point you in the right direction in each chapter and make sure you're studying the right stuff. Some of these links, and there's literally dozens and dozens of these, will lead you to some more detailed videos. So this is just a really cool little study tool. And I say that because I made it for people like you. So take advantage of it, all right? So chapter 1, when you guys get into NASM's textbook here, 7th edition, chapter 1 and 2 are part of section 1, and this is like professional development within the industry. So there are some components of these two chapters that actually are really important, like down the line for you as you're figuring out where you want to go. Do you want to be an independent contractor? Do you want to go and work for another gym, which is probably a good mode for a lot of people, and other things that go along with that. So there's some great topics in here, but I just want to say from the beginning, it's not going to be heavily weighed on the exam. These are two chapters that you should go through once and probably not need to come back to, unlike some of the other concepts that are a little bit more challenging. So definitely anything's fair game on the exam, you should go through these chapters, but these would be the types of chapters that I would be more lightly browsing and reading through versus some of the other chapters where you're gonna be reviewing multiple times and retaking quizzes because of the science and the depth of knowledge. So the depth of knowledge is not super deep here. These are areas that are gonna be important to you in the 6 to 12 to 18, 24 months after you guys actually get certified and figuring out. So feel free, you can always come back to some of these to get some perspective on where you want to go. But inside the first chapter, specifically modern state of health and fitness, right, chapter 1, they do refer to and talk about the global state of health. So there are some statistics that occasionally pop up inside of here relative to obesity and preventable diseases. So these are ones that, again, browse through, read the material, be familiar with, but it's probably not stuff you need to spend hours and hours studying and going through. And this is where they do introduce some concepts like BMI, what it is, what it means. They talk a little bit about some of the most common conditions. So there's like a recognition level knowledge that you need of those things, but they're not ones you should be spending tons of time studying on, all right? So they also talk a little bit about the CPT's role in what they call the allied healthcare continuum. So that's one that not only might that come up on the exam, like what the allied healthcare continuum looks like, but I do think is actually pretty valuable because it starts to point out from the beginning that there's a lot of crossover between what we do and other pros out there in the health and fitness industry, and you building a good network of other medical professionals, massage therapists, doctors. It's only going to serve you long-term inside the industry, all right? And then as you guys download the, like I said, you download the study guide, you can see here where it says section 1, that little yellow highlighted, that also links you guys to flashcards. So when it comes to the terms, I'm not gonna go through and just read out loud the terms you guys need to know because there's a lot of terminology and a lot of it is repetitive and repeats itself throughout, but we've created some Quizlet flashcards for you guys. So you guys can use that from that standpoint. And this is actually a chapter where if you want a more detailed breakdown on this chapter specifically, this is one we actually do have. We have the full-length breakdown on our YouTube channel. The full-length breakdown we do with our students for our courses. We don't have every chapter on here, but that's one you can actually refer to and get a more detailed breakdown. So chapter 1, again, it's kind of just setting the stage, introducing NASM, establishing why it's important, right? We've got to kind of intro into, but not the most important stuff. And then getting into the personal training profession. Just, again, this is all part of this section 1 material that is like professionalism within the industry. And they talk a little bit about different employment settings and different routes of, of growth inside the industry. I think regardless, like your takeaway from this is no matter what, you just need to get good at training first. So let's make that your primary focus and just know that training really does, right? Entry into personal training opens up the doors to so many other things you might not know about. The fitness education side of things, working in management, working in companies that are related to health and fitness, and your knowledge of these things is going to be helpful, but it's not directly training clients, online training. There's so much out there, right? And I'm sure you guys already have some great ideas coming in, but they give you guys some of these things in there too. And they really honestly do to try to cover all these concepts like marketing, a little bit of sales, and all this stuff that is kind of talked about in this chapter. It's done in a very short little like snippet. So again, be familiar with understanding SWOT analysis, the 4 Ps of marketing. These are, potential questions that may come up on the exam. But again, all of chapters 1 and 2 end up being 10% or less of your exam. So they're not ones that, as we're studying, you guys are going through material, I wouldn't spend a ton of time on them. But I would, and I link this in here for you guys too, be familiar with the CEU requirements because I can't tell you how common it is. It's like almost every personal trainer I know isn't organized and isn't always tracking their CEUs, and all of a sudden it's like 1 month before their NASM CPT is going to be up and they're like, oh crap, I haven't got any CEUs yet. So review those requirements so you can be better prepared than most other coaches and trainers. But section 1, off to the side, guys. I wouldn't spend too much additional time, especially if you go through and you guys take the quizzes associated with those chapters and you take the section quiz and you guys do well, then I would move on, maybe don't even look back at it again because there's a lot more complicated stuff inside the material, some of which we'll get to, especially in section 3. All right, so section 2, this stuff actually, this is probably like some of the most important content for your 5 to 10 years down the road success, right? For the coaches and trainers who are just killing it in the industry, doing well, providing transformations for clients. This is the stuff that they really understand and know, which is like behavioral change psychology, and how to coach people, which is probably the most challenging stuff. The anatomy, the physiology, the science piece isn't that challenging, right? It's the human body. You just got to learn it. This stuff is challenging because people are complicated. But specifically as far as content goes, psychology of exercise, some things you really want to pay attention to. There's some, some decent terminology in here, especially when it gets into different motivational types, like concepts surrounding motivation, intrinsic versus extrinsic. Understand the differences between those two, right? Knowing intrinsic motivation is a little bit more like I wake up and I enjoy exercise and that's why I do it. Extrinsic, like I'm motivated by some outside factor. So again, we've got a video in here that talks more in depth about that, but be familiar with those concepts, right? The concepts surrounding motivation. And these are great because, you're gonna have to find different ways of motivating clients along the way, right? Because again, there's human physiology, which is the science of things inside the gym. And then there's human psychology, which is like really complicated to get people to do the things that they actually know they need to do, but they just for some reason won't do. So there's really a lot of gold inside of here. And I would say that beyond you guys getting certified, right, go on past the NASM CPT, and then like all the books that you read for the next 12 months, right, you will benefit massively if they are related to behavioral change, client psychology, all these things, because this is the ultimate challenge for most coaches if you want to make it all work long term. So either way, no intrinsic, extrinsic motivation. Have a working knowledge. They talk a little bit inside this chapter about like the difference of different types of goals, process goals and outcome goals. The truth is most clients and individuals are not great at goal setting in general. So there is some good stuff in here that will make sure as you're starting out with clients that hopefully you're not only better understanding like psychologically how they might function and the kind of accountability and coaching they might need, but you can also help them just set up better goals, because that alone can be a huge difference maker for people in creating more process-oriented goals and not just relying on outcome goals, which aren't always in our control, but process goals definitely are. All right. Outside of that, also inside, and I have a specific table for you guys inside of chapter 3, right? So table 3-2 inside your material, you guys should review that one, right? Be able to differentiate the different types of social support. And I say that because this is one that, oddly enough, tends to come up quite often on some of your quiz questions, exam questions, relative to the material in here as well. And then, just understand how all this stuff fits back together. So I have additional video for you guys you can check out, right? So understand some of these different pieces, and then that blends right well. And obviously there's a lot of terminology related you guys should review, but I think a lot of it is hopefully more recognition level than super deep. So you guys can use the Quizlet for that. And chapter 4, behavioral coaching, like the application of some of these psychological concepts. So table 4-1 in here, inside your guys' book, gives you guys some specific behavioral change techniques relative to this, stages of change model, which is another concept in this chapter that consistently comes up on the exam. Understanding the trans-theoretical model of behavioral change, knowing, understanding when people are in pre-contemplation, like not even thinking about exercise, to contemplation, to preparation, making plans, maybe starting to do something, action, they're doing it consistently, and then maintenance, right, been doing it 6 months or more. You really want to understand that trans-theoretical model. Not only does it give you some good insight into where people are and like what types of strategies might motivate them to make it to the next stage or stay consistent, but it's also one that consistently comes up inside some of the questions, all right? Also, be familiar with SMART goal setting, understand specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, timely. Talk about that inside of the chapter materials. Have general understanding of behavioral strategies like enhancing self-efficacy, planning, and monitoring. There's some good little chapters and paragraphs, or some good paragraphs inside this chapter on that, and understanding those concepts. Now those consistently come up, and again, they play a pretty big role, right? The idea of self-efficacy, like, do I actually believe, this is really important for clients if they're gonna work out with you, do I actually believe that by working together and doing these things, I can even accomplish it? That's a huge one. We wanna find ways to increase self-efficacy for clients. And then the other thing, they kind of briefly talk about initial sessions, but this stuff plays a major role in your sales presentations, your initial consultations with clients. NASM doesn't talk a lot about that specifically, but aside from getting people moving a little bit, this is the stuff that for me, if I have someone come in and they're a potential client, they haven't signed up yet, these are the kinds of things I'm gonna wanna kind of dive into and get a take on in that first session. So the right questions can be really helpful here, because coaching is all about getting people to take action, and part of that process is sales and signing up with you, whether you love that component of it or not. All right, so again, I'm gonna undersell some of the sections as we go through, because I want to keep you guys focused on the most important stuff, and we just have a lot of stuff to get through. So chapters 1-4, pretty light, right? Pretty light. Even in the courses that we run here, I don't spend tons and tons of time reiterating and beating down the door on reviewing some of the stuff from those first 4 chapters. I think it's stuff that, as far as depth of knowledge and learning, most people consume a little bit easier, and most people start to get tripped up more as we get into section 3. So that's where I want to jump in and spend more time. Section 3, basic and applied sciences. This is the bulk. Chapters, really getting into chapters 5-10, is the bulk of like the anatomy, physiology, biomechanics, like more the science side of what we're learning as an entry-level personal trainer. So the complicated material, most of it lies inside of here. But one thing I just want to remind you guys of is with that, so chapters 5-10, because a lot of people get like stuck up for weeks and weeks and weeks on chapter 7. is if you look at it, all of section 3 in and of itself is chapters 5 through 10, right? And that being said, it's only 15% of the exam. So it is very important, but it's not the most important stuff, right? As we compare to exercise technique, program design, getting into some of these other things. All right, you guys can hear we got some action back here because we're in the gym right now, right? Living the gym life. We've got someone about to be pushing the sled back here. You guys can probably hear my man Andy, Mr. Motivation. I love it, guys. All right, so yeah, so I just wanted to point that out. Come back, 15%. There's a lot of stuff in here, a lot of, deep knowledge. These are things that individuals like myself who went to college, master's degrees in exercise science, biomechanics. We spent semesters on these individual topics. And so you're kind of presented in some ways. I'm going to point out some of the stuff you don't need to know the depth in which you might think that you do. All right, so chapters 5 through 10, it's a lot. And it does give you foundational info, but don't kill yourself with some of it. So the first one, chapter 5, this isn't important. Chapter 5 and chapter 7, important chapters, partially because there's a lot of terminology inside those chapters that is going to come back up for you guys. It's going to be reintroduced again further along the way, but it's also, again, it's like the bulk of like understanding the human movement system. So especially chapter 5, you look at it, we've got the nervous system, the muscular, and the skeletal. These are like deep, complex systems on their own, and they're all covered inside of one chapter. So the most important concept you can take away from chapter 5, and mostly because even terminology-wise, this will come up on your exam every single time, is make sure you understand what the human movement system is and why it matters. It's the integration of, right, the coordination of your nervous system, your skeletal system, and your muscular system, and they all work together. And the truth is, NASM, I think, does a great job of bringing these three together because a lot of people just focus on the cardiovascular system and the muscular system. But the muscular system doesn't operate without the others, right? Without this skeletal, have the relationship between our skeletal system as a system of levers and our neurological system as the part that controls all of it, right? So that neurological component is huge. It's massively undertrained, massively undervalued, and it is one of the bigger benefits of stabilization training is brain to body, which so many people need more of. So that's my soapbox. But either way, understand the human movement system. It's the integration of these three. If anything is off in those three systems, it will impact the others, right? Muscular, if I have an injury, that's going to impact neurological system and communication. If I have something, either A, just bad motor learning, like I haven't done an exercise a lot, my nervous system, that's going to impact how I engage my muscles, right? They're all connected that way. But inside of here, also know the various components, like understand and be familiar with like just general terms surrounding the nervous system. Again, this is like our text messaging system that sends signals to our body to tell it what to do, to tell it to move, to react to stimuli, everything. We have our central nervous system and our peripheral nervous system, right? Central nervous system, brain and spinal cord. Peripheral nervous system, our periphery, right? Like our arms, our appendages, all the information that goes back and forth. And then we also break it down even further into our somatic and our autonomic. All right, so you can think of autonomic, kind of sounds like automatic. This is the part of our nervous system that serves like our organs, things we don't want to think about. Like you don't want to think about your heart beating. You just want it to beat, right? You don't want to think about digestion. You just want to digest. So those are part of our autonomic nervous system. And then we have our somatic nervous system, which is more conscious motion and other things too, all right? And then also understand, they talk in there about the 3 primary functions of the nervous system. All right, 3 primary functions. Look it up inside of chapter 5, right? We have sensory, right? We gather information from our environment. We have integrative, which means like actually deciphering what that information is and like what it means. And then we have motor, which means our response. So sensory, integrative, and motor. Read the material surrounding those. That stuff's important. And then some common mechanisms that'll come back up. You'll see muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs come up quite often. So you really want to know those babies inside and out, not only just from a chapter 5 standpoint, but it'll actually come back up again inside of flexibility, right? Because our brain, the nervous system, is really what for most people is controlling positions and mobility and flexibility, and a lot of it has to do with muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs because they're constantly giving us information. That's really what they are, right? They're mechanoreceptors, so they sense mechanical information and they give it back to our body so we know what to do with it. We have them all throughout. Just keep in mind muscle spindles, those sit in the belly, right? Let me give you guys a right angle. They sit in the belly of our muscle fibers themselves. They are sensitive to rapid changes in length, all right? And when we have activation there, they cause contraction in that same area. So even for you guys, start doing some little pogo hops here, right? I'm doing most of this from my calves, my gastroc, right? Gastroc and soleus, those two primary calf muscles. And I have a little rapid stretch happening. So I get some muscle spindle activity, which tells that muscle to contract a little bit harder. So call it protective, call it information, it's both of those things. And then our Golgi tendon organs, just like it sounds, those exist in the actual tendons of our muscle. Those are more sensitive to mechanical tension, right? So if they sense a large amount of tension, or to the degree of tension they sense, they will cause neurological relaxation. So all that stuff's in your material, but yeah, no Golgi tendon organs, no muscle spindles. Those will come back up, and they'll be related to a lot of other things throughout the course as we get into flexibility chapters and just knowing how our body gets information. All right, overall proprioception, that will be a word that comes up again and again. So have a good working definition of it, all right? And if you want to deep dive into the nervous system, I have on here for you guys, there's actually a really cool, you guys are watching this video on YouTube anyway, so if you guys want some good scientific breakdowns, especially the stuff like chapters 5 through 10, the human systems, so many of us are visual learners, and there is an education course, or the education page here on YouTube, Crash Course. So check them out. I linked you guys to one of their playlists in here, but they just do a really cool job of like visualizing things like muscle contraction and digestion and just human systems, you know, type information. So check that out if you want to go deeper and really get a good understanding. All right, so chapter 5, lots of good stuff there. And again, inside of the science stuff, these are ones where, you know, I would definitely be practicing the flashcards, using our, you know, use those little links here. You see section 3, practice the flashcards, because terminology is easy to get right or it's easy to get wrong inside the material. All right, outside of that, basic knowledge of the skeletal system, right? And I say that, right, knowing what the skeletal system does. It's a system of levers, right? We create red blood cells in our bones, but I think especially understanding protection and a system of levers, because that's what we end up using here in the gym most times, right? A lot of it's about movement and exercise, and so if we understand that muscles, right, they attach to this like system that we have, and when they pull, they allow our levers to move. So really our skeletal system is what allows us to move. Muscles can pull on those bones, and we can create exercises and movements. So don't get bogged down, just know the primary ones, because you're not gonna get asked a question that's like, name this bone. That's not how the exam is gonna be, but your knowledge of the primary bones of the body, like knowing, for example, the humerus, the radius, the ulna. Don't get caught up memorizing all the bones of the hands and the feet. Truthfully, because initially as a coach, you're not going to use it. Like that information is not going to be useful for you. I think the takeaway is like, those are complex areas. Our hands and our feet, complex from bone structure, complex from a lot of our like proprioception coming from our hands and our feet, which makes sense. That's how we like interact with the world. But don't worry about memorizing bones there, okay? So just basic understanding. And if you want my little cheat, because obviously inside of this we have skeletal system, we also have our muscular system, and you're going to need to know anatomy. You're going to need to know the primary movers of the body. You know, not just knowing chest, but like pectoralis major, not just knowing back muscles, but latissimus dorsi, biceps brachii, not just quads, but rectus femoris, vastus medialis, vastus lateralis, more than I can get into just on this video. But one of the best strategies you can do, aside from like, you know, look up additional videos, we've got some good stuff on here as well, is actually, if you guys get on Google, this is your strategy. Do it for skeletal and do it for muscular, and I promise you'll be on your way to memorizing these things, is Google muscular anatomy or blank muscular anatomy chart, and then also Google blank skeletal anatomy chart. And what you'll find is some printouts, right, with blank spaces pointing to bones and the primary muscles. Find a decent one, there's tons out there. Find one, print out like 10 of them, right? Print out like 10 of the skeletal ones, print out like 10 of the muscular ones, and just do each one once a week. That's it, right? So go through, name all the bones you can name on the skeletal one, and then go look up the ones you don't know, and then set it aside. And then do the same thing for the muscles. Name all the muscles you can think of and you can find, and then the ones that you're like, I don't know the name of it, go look it up, right? And that's your way of self-teaching and more of a visual mindset. And if you do that literally just at least once with each every week for the next like 6 to 8 weeks, promise you, you'll be at a really great place because it forces you to then go look up those specific muscles, and you'll read a little bit about them. And I think even as a trainer, that's really helpful, because then you know where it starts, you know where it ends, it only shortens, now you know what movements it does. All right, that's our takeaway. You know, there's a lot in there, there's so much to get done. But don't get bogged down memorizing the bones, just keep in mind form follows function. They talk a lot about different bone types. I wouldn't spend too much time on that. Master knowledge surrounding the spine, understanding like the structure of our vertebra, our sacrum, our lumbar spine, our thoracic spine, our cervical spine. Although you're probably not going to get asked like how many cervical vertebrae do we have, or how many thoracic. It is helpful to know those things because it's going to give you an indication of like how many joints are there. Should I have more or less movement there? And it's just such a common area of injury for people as well. So be knowledgeable about the spine as far as all the other bones go. All right, outside of that, they're just levers, and we get to pull on them and create torque. All right, be able to recognize skeletal muscle, but don't get bogged down with like the complexity. Know the basics, all right, because they get into talking about like, you know, paramecium, epimecium, fascicles, M lines, Z lines. Chances are, if that stuff's new to you, you're probably not going to memorize it to the T. So I think it's more so understanding like, you know, skeletal muscle, understand the difference between type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers, slow twitch versus fast twitch. One fatigues faster, one has more endurance, like know some of those basics. But again, it's easy to get bogged down with some of this stuff. And if you guys want, check out that crash course videos as well, because they do have some good visuals for you guys. All right, be able to explain the basics of sliding filament theory, knowing that inside the microscopic levels of our muscle fibers, this is like my super like elementary visual, right? We actually have this sliding filament theory, actin and myosin, these protein filaments, they cross over each other and create connection and contraction. That's how muscle contraction happens. So basic understanding of those things, all right? Understand that, no type 1 versus type 2 muscle fibers. So like I said, chapter 5 alone is thick, right? It's thick. There's a lot of stuff in here, but you got to remember, all of chapters 5 through 10 are only going to be 15% of your exam questions. So there's only so many questions they can ask. And so you would hope, right, by focusing on the most important concepts, just don't get caught up in some of the minutia. All right, so again, chapter 5, this is a lot. I mean, like I said, that was semesters in college for me to master the information. So don't get too caught up in some of the complexity they talk about in there. All right, either way, some resources for you guys. Moving on, chapter 6 here. All right, so chapter 6, this again covers quite a few systems, our cardiovascular, our endocrine, and our digestive. So the fact that we're covering these 3 complex systems in one chapter, again, probably tells you that from a scope of everything that you're initially going to be responsible for as a great coach and trainer, this is probably going to be a smaller amount, right? They're only going to need to have a certain level of expertise here. And I'll truthfully even say, as we get into the digestive system, I barely even talk about it inside of our courses. Again, not because it's not important, right? Digestive health is massively important, but as a new entry-level personal trainer, not your main priority. Chances of you getting asked a question on the digestive system are very low. I would almost not spend time on it, all right? So again, don't offend anybody. If you're someone who's got digestive issues, I know it's important, but it's not really in our wheelhouse anyhow. So, all right, focusing first. Understand the 2 components of our cardiorespiratory system. Know, like understanding, right, that it's, you know, functions of each, our heart, our vessels, our lungs. Understanding how this cardiovascular system works together, right? From a basic standpoint of knowing that the heart is the pump. We have deoxygenated blood coming in. That blood has to go through left side of the heart, right? Left atria, left ventricle, passes to our lungs. You know, gas exchange, we get rid of CO2, we get oxygen in, we bring it back to the left side of the heart here, and then we have, you know, passes through our atria, ventricle, and then poof, we push that oxygenated blood out to the body and the tissues. All right, so I say that, again, questions asked, probably not super deep there, but just a basic understanding of blood flow through the heart and how this heart functions. It does function a little different from a muscle, like from a tissue standpoint. Skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle, they have some different components. I won't confuse you too much with that. But cardiac tissue is unique. And this would be part of, again, that autonomic nervous system that feeds. You want automatic depolarization of the heart. And they talk a little bit in there about the AV node and SA node, so just be somewhat familiar. And again, they go into a little bit of depth on like breathing mechanics and how like our respiratory system fits into that. I wouldn't worry too much from an exam standpoint, but I think knowing, hey, if there's one thing that people struggle with here in the gym world, I can tell you, it is knowing how to breathe. Right? Knowing the role and how to breathe through a diaphragm versus other muscles. So I do think there's some great coaching value in reviewing some of that information, you know, this basic stuff that they talk about as far as breathing mechanics and how we should be breathing, inspiration, expiration, passive, all those things, all right? So outside of that, I'm not gonna focus too much on there. Have a basic knowledge of the endocrine system. All right, I say basic because you don't need to get into understanding everything about the anterior pituitary hormones. Although the endocrine system, master regulator, controls everything, again, you're not endocrinologists, so your level of knowledge is like basic. And I think especially in here when they talk about some specific hormones like insulin, glucagon, growth hormone, testosterone, estrogen. These are ones that may be a little bit more related to understanding what we're doing here in the gym, and with glucagon and insulin end up playing a pretty important role when it gets to understanding metabolism, energy systems, how our body processes food and gets ATP, right? So there's, I think, some nutrition science that relates back to there as well. You know, probably some hormones you guys have heard of before: cortisol, testosterone, estrogen, growth hormone. Just familiar with those, and just know how sleep and exercise impact those hormone levels. All right, and like I mentioned, I'm not even going to talk about digestive system, not because it's not important, but in the scope of everything we're doing, it is not that important for you guys to study. All right, cool. Hey, if you guys are with me, feel free, pause, take a little water break. All right, come back to this. This is a lot, but we're going to make our way through all this stuff right now. Okay, chapter 6, we're moving along. Chapter 7, human movement science. I mentioned this before, right? Our human movement system and HMS, human movement science. Now we get into understanding some more anatomical terminology, some stuff that you might be, as you're going through the materials, you're like, Joe, I'm never going to use it to the client. Like, I'm never going to talk about the frontal plane or the transverse plane. I'm never going to talk about flexion, extension, abduction. Well, first off, you might be surprised, because you will find clients along the way that love learning what they're doing. And, but you're right, some of the terms you may not use on a daily basis, but your mastery of it is kind of considered to be, again, it's commitment to your craft and what you're doing. So suck it up, buttercup. There's some terms you got to learn. You know, use the flashcards as we go. But understanding and be able to apply this concept, kinetic chain concepts. So the idea that we have forces, the kinetic chain, like our entire body is linked together, right? Via connective tissue, muscles, joints, and forces translate up and down, right? Most forces come from ground reaction force. As I go to walk in one direction, my core, boom, I generate forces down through my lower limbs. The earth pushes off, I push, you know, and I go in whatever direction I'm going. So it's part of this fact is like nothing is really in isolation or working on its own. And if we have issues going on in one area like the shoulder, it could be things happening above or below that kinetic chain, you know, checkpoint that are causing it. So either way, understanding some of these concepts, the importance of the kinetic chain and stable versus mobile joints, these are some videos you guys should check out. I think help give you guys a better understanding of like why this kinetic chain stuff matters, because I do find this stuff will definitely help you be a great coach, working around injuries and issues and just putting people in better positions, because everyone's body you're going to find moves differently. You know, squats, lunges, pushes, pulls, it's all going to look unique to the person you're working with, and this stuff is the foundation of that knowledge. Outside of that, table 7.1, right? So back to some specific stuff. If you guys want to write some things down, table 7.1, memorize some of the anatomical terminology, right? These are like movement and anatomical based things, understanding, right? Understanding anatomical position, you know, getting into understanding flexion, extension, information about the sagittal plane, transverse plane, all the stuff that is referred to in these like chapters 5 and 7 and come back. These are things that you're going to want to spend some time with. And I think table 7-1 does a great job of just giving you some of that stuff, boom, right there. And then have application level knowledge of planes of motion. So I do have a video that's like more in-depth breakdown, but meaning, understanding not just like what is transverse, right? Rotation, frontal plane, it's like the sideways hallway where abduction and adduction happen, sagittal plane, but also understanding like how and where do I integrate that into my training, right? That's stuff that may not be as important for NASM, but I'm telling you, if you want to make good use of what you're learning right now, just be thinking about that. Like, how do I integrate more transverse plane? Maybe it's in my dynamic warm-ups, right? If you find a lot of the warm-ups we have on our YouTube channel, you'll see frontal plane, transverse plane, we sneak those in for a lot of people in what we call prep and prime, like early on in their training sessions to get them moving better. And then a lot of foundational strength still happens in the sagittal plane. But either way, planes of motion you need to know, and great coaches are keen to figure out how to apply that for people, because most people won't move in all these different directions if they're not doing it with us. So it's our responsibility to do so, all right? And then understand the various muscle contraction types, knowing the difference between, right, our isometric contraction, our eccentric contraction, and our concentric contraction. All three have value, and you guys will find we have a great video on here with breaking down these different muscle contraction types, and I talk more about it. Most people do not train appropriately. They don't train enough isometrics, and they don't do enough focus on the eccentric component, both of which are wildly important when it comes to setting that stabilization foundation, injury prevention. They're also just really important for performance down the road. So eccentrics, isometrics, that alone can like totally transform your workout. So check those things out. All right, so chapter 7, moving on to some more stuff in here. Understand the various roles of muscles as movers. So some of the terms in here that are very important: agonist, antagonist, synergist, stabilizer. They're going to come up on your guys' exam 100% for sure. And these also just give you a good understanding of how these muscles in the body work together, right? We work in very much opposition. You know, I've got an agonist. Antagonist usually is on the opposite side of the body. Neurologically, my body shuts down when I have contraction on one side. Reciprocal inhibition is the term that says my body neurologically shuts down the opposite side. That'll come back when it comes to thinking about flexibility, when you guys are learning about the overhead squat, some of the stuff inside of chapters, chapter 12 with assessments. So understanding those would be great. And then they talk a little bit about open and closed chain movements, which sometimes can be confusing, but review that stuff. Terminology surrounding muscle balance, reciprocal inhibition, like I mentioned, stretch shortening cycle. There's a lot of terms in this chapter, right? That's why I think it's so heavy for so many people. You know, it's common inside of some of the Facebook groups, even our free Facebook group that we have, which you guys can check the link and join here as well, is that a lot of people are constantly like, man, chapter 7 I get hung up on. What are my best ways to study it? Some of it is just break it up. You know, once you've gotten through it, come back to it, right? Don't wait to move on in the material, because even though there's a lot in here and it does set the foundation, it's still just one chapter out of 5 that make up 15% of your exam. So just for some frame of reference, understand the terminology, and then I would say have application level knowledge of things like the force couple and force velocity curve, all right? Because again, force couple relationships, this is just the fact that like in certain areas of our body, we have more muscles working together to control things like our shoulder blades, like our hips, the pelvis, and then force velocity curve, which may be less applicable on a regular basis. But again, inside of here, you guys got some video breakdowns. And as you can see, heavy chapter, a lot of things in here, a lot of bullet points, basic understanding of our muscular subsystems. This is new in the 7th edition, right? If you guys are studying for your 7th edition exam, which I'm sure you are if you're watching this video, this stuff is kind of new in the material. And I think it's a good thing, but it is some higher level thinking, right? It's one thing to like learn anatomy, and now you got to figure out how these muscles work together. And the way that our anatomy is structured is that certain muscle groups have a stronger synergistic relationship to provide certain movements. So for example, what they call like our anterior sling of the body, right? Having more to do with the external obliques on one side and the adductors on the opposite. That's very important for controlling and creating rotation. Those muscles, if you look at them, there's like more of like, you can see the kind of connected line. And it's more that even though they're different muscles, from a structure standpoint, our body transfer forces, very effectively in those directions through those muscles. They're meant to have a synergistic relationship. Same thing with our posterior sling, which is going to be lats on one side and glutes on the opposite. That one's super obvious because as you look at the X pattern of the anatomy of the body, you're like, oh yeah, I see how forces translate there. And they also do like, the lateral subsystem. So those are valuable. And you might not be able to do a lot with it right now, but just be familiar with those because I think as you get further down the road with training, some of that will come back and make more sense to you guys too. All right, be able to recognize various lever systems. Yeah, just basic understanding of levers. First, second, third class lever, right? Easiest to remember. Most of your body, like you see here the bicep, most of the human body is a third class lever. First class lever, second class lever, we don't have too many examples of those, but the book gives you a feel. Breathe in for a second, right? There's a lot of stuff there just from chapters 1 through 7. So I just want to say that because I understand any overwhelm you might have. All right, so again, this video, a reminder for you guys can find timestamps in the description below as well if you're trying to get some info on certain topics. We're breaking down the most important things and talking a little bit about specific ones, so feel free to bounce around if you guys need to. And you'll also find we just have some other bonuses inside of the study guide, so some stuff that honestly I just know from training clients for 16 years and working with literally thousands of people, that these are the things that either maybe aren't as explained as well in the NASM text as they could be in like a practical way, or they're things that aren't even talked about in here that you just need to be thinking about if you want to actually make all this work and not just get certified, but actually train clients. All right, so chapter 8, exercise, metabolism, and bioenergetics. I love the energy system stuff. It's not going to be a huge component of your exam, but I love it because this is an area, especially as you tie together chapter 8, like bioenergetics, the energy systems, and also like the cardiovascular training chapter. A lot of people in the industry at large, I don't think does a great job of really educating trainers on like how to help people improve their energy systems and train energy systems and cardiovascular training. It's very entry level, right? Versus strength training, we get a lot of info on, and there's like some progressive methods, but maybe not as much. So either way, this one's valuable because we do have these 3 primary energy systems. You need to understand that and understand the relevance to all of this is like, hey, bioenergetics and metabolism, we're trying to break down food, right? It's really like, what's the byproduct of protein, carbs, and fats? We need to get it broken down into ATP because inside of our muscle fibers and cells, like that's what we utilize. Like that's the energy currency. And so it's all about breaking down these macros, these substrates they're called, in order to be able to use them as fuel. So be familiar with, but don't get caught up, because in the chapters in here, you might see things like description of like the electron transport chain and the Krebs cycle and beta oxidation. I wouldn't worry about memorizing those things. I think know what they relate to, like know that beta oxidation relates to, it's like, you know, it's a more time-consuming process to break down fat for fuel, but it also makes it more efficient. We get more energy from it, but don't memorize the process, right? Don't memorize the equations. It's not going to come up in your exam. It's also not going to be helpful for you guys, right? Because I know a lot of the stuff, and some of it day to day, it's not going to be the most important. All right, so basic information there. Know each and understand each role that the macronutrients play: proteins, carbs, and fats. That'll obviously tie into the nutrition chapter that comes after this as well. All three play important roles in either energy production or management in general, all right? And then be able to appropriately apply these three energy systems, knowing like not just what is the ATP phosphocreatine, but if you see someone doing something in the gym, is that more ATP PC dominant? Like which energy system are they mostly relying upon? Which you should be able to figure out by the intensity and the duration in which they're doing it, right? The chapter talks about that inverse relation between duration and intensity. You can't do something super intense for a long period of time, but higher intensity is going to rely more upon that ATP phosphocreatine and the glycolytic. All right, so know those things. Be familiar. Again, another specific table for you guys. Table 8-1 is a great one, so review that, right, if you haven't gotten there yet. And then just know all the factors that contribute to total daily energy expenditure. There's some good talk in here, you know, about like pretty much what all goes into how many calories someone burns in a day. You know, maybe not so much because you're going to try to calculate that for every person. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. But just good understanding that, like, hey, we have RMR, our resting metabolic rate, right? If I'm just lying down for a day, what happens? How much calorie or how many calories do I burn? Then I have activity thermogenesis. Then we have NEAT, right? Non-exercise, which is huge for people. Like, how much do you move every day? And then the thermic effect of food. All these blend into this to understand. And this can be good education for clients down the road as well, right? And that all leads us right into chapter 9 with nutrition, all right? And we're kind of getting to the end of this, like section 3, right? The end of the science piece here too. And this is one that we all know, right? It's like, dang it, Joe, we all know nutrition is going to be massively important, right? I want to learn more about that because I know that's going to be what, you know, makes or breaks a lot of people's success. And you can see on here, I don't have a lot of bullet points. And that is because you can see in the context of everything you guys are learning with NASM, the industry doesn't consider in-depth, like super deep nutrition knowledge to be like as essential as exercise programming, which makes sense, right? Depending on what state you guys might be in, you know, well, I'm in the beautiful state of Florida here in the US, and we actually have relatively like relaxed, you know, laws and legislation around nutrition, where as long as you're not working with someone who, and again, this is 2022 as I'm shooting this video, so maybe it changes, but as long as you're not working with someone who's considered a special population, you can give a lot of advice. Not every state's like that, so you gotta be aware of your own state laws, but being a resource, being knowledgeable about nutrition is going to be huge because clients are going to come in expecting some help. And your level of help that you give is going to be up to you. It's going to be up to how you want to run your business, and it's going to be up to the state that you live in, the country you live in, but either way. And so this chapter does talk about scope of practice, which you want to be familiar with. You want to make sure you're operating appropriately. And the good thing is where most people go wrong with scope of practice, which is like trying to give someone a cut and dry meal plan, it's also, look at most of the great nutritional coaching companies out there, it's also not what's going to work well for most people, right, versus teaching habits. So I truly believe that if this is an area, this is a huge area to potentially add on and build inside your business. If you guys are going to be a personal trainer and then you're able to offer nutrition coaching, that's a whole nother like video in and of itself. So it's a huge additional business builder, I think, for you guys. And I think it's a great secondary learning piece. So I think for a lot of you guys, if you're super interested in nutrition, you want to do a lot, you want to help clients with it, that should probably be your next, like start to work with your first 3 to 5 clients, and then your next course might be, you know, maybe it's the NASM CNC Certified Nutrition Coach, maybe it's Precision Nutrition. You know, I think there's some good options out there, but I do think it's like a great next tier to add on because you're going to want to be knowledgeable. But knowledge-wise, be familiar in this chapter with the basics, understand the macronutrients, know how many calories are associated with each one, you know, the roles that proteins, carbs, and fats play inside the body, be familiar with those, but don't get too caught up on the information about digestion and absorption. Again, it's not going to be a lot on your exam, and truthfully, I don't really know that it's in our wheelhouse or what we should be talking about. So, nutrition, I think it's huge. I love learning about it, but not a massive component of the NASM exam. So, sorry, but is what it is. All right, chapter 10, supplementation, kind of right in the same line. My takeaway from this chapter is just browse and be familiar with some of the supplements that they refer to. You know, I wouldn't be inside of here worried about like RDAs, recommended daily allowances, like more in-depth knowledge there. First off, if you really want to know, you can always look it up. Second off, you're not going to be tested on it. So understanding general information here inside the supplementation chapter, like you said, I don't even give a lot on here, but people are going to have questions. So I think for your goal beyond just passing the exam is you want to strive to be a resource for people, and I think that's the best that we can do. All right, so guys, that chapters 5 through 10, that entire section, it is a lot of stuff. All right, it's a lot of chapters. Hopefully you guys can review, even come back to, hopefully reviewing some of those bullet points, and of course, download this study guide so you can refer back to it. We'll keep you guys focused on the most important concepts as you're reading through those chapters and you're going through the online material, all right? And you guys can see, I won't go in on here, inside this study guide, we actually have some bonus stuff that we give you guys, some free resources for nutrition, like some great packets you can use with clients, because I do think early on, just having some good materials to like talk through with people is half the battle. It's a great way to start off as you guys get into training. It's a great way to start off helping people with their nutrition without going beyond your scope of practice, or really just going beyond what you're comfortable like helping someone with. But again, these are some great resources you guys can download. Relative nutrition coaching. But back to our NASM stuff. You guys are rocking right now. We're making our way through here, moving into section 4 of 6. We're through our first 3 sections, right? Which again, you can look, again, not a major component. The next couple sections, right, this ends up being like a big piece of the exam. Section 4, assessment. Section 4, assessment. This is chapters 11, chapters 12, and this covers everything from, you know, us talking through and understanding how to do, you know, body composition, the different methods of body composition testing, to the bread and butter, and this is really where ding, 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 I think you should pay the most attention, is the dynamic and postural, you know, the posture, static posture and the dynamic movement assessments, overhead squat, push-pull assessment, right? First off, this is like NASM's bread and butter as far as an organization. It's really what they're well known for. And it does tie together a lot of other information, stuff that was in chapter 5, chapter 7, your knowledge of muscular anatomy. So a lot gets encompassed in here. So focusing on those things, again, from a test standpoint. So either way, chapters 11 and 12, diving into all this stuff. If you guys want like detailed breakdowns of like the overhead squat specifically, which I'm not going to do in this video, we have other videos. You guys can find those on YouTube here on our channel, and you guys can also find them linked in this document as well. All right, but chapter 11, be able to explain the purpose of assessments as well as how they relate to identifying contraindications, because that's really what we want to do. Truthfully, I can tell you guys from working with clients for a long time in this environment, you want to take care of people, right? People want to be with a coach and a trainer who has their best interests in mind, all right? You really care about people, and you're not rushing the process. And a lot of people are scared to spend time, you know, taking time sitting down in the gym the first time you get together and like talking through these questions and like really making this a big part of what you do. But I think it's what separates fitness pros from, again, not to use my own name, but just the average Joe in fitness pros, is like you really want to take the standpoint of being a professional here, not only from a liability standpoint inside of chapter 11, knowing the right questions to ask, knowing the minimum that you should go through being the PAR Q. It's what you need to do from a liability standpoint. So God forbid you ever find yourself in like a lawsuit or anything else, that you've got documentation, which unfortunately most coaches don't. You've got appropriate documentation, but also just so that you're setting out on the right foot. You're building a relationship. People can tell from the beginning you're a professional. It's going to allow you to charge a lot more money down the road, and just make sure you're getting the right information, right? You want to make sure you're taking care of people. So I think this stuff is great. Some of it is good, not all of it is usable, and I think useful. For example, inside of chapter 11, things like understanding how to take blood pressure with a blood pressure cuff. I used to teach these things whenever I used to work for the university, and we would teach personal training courses, and we would teach that. We would also teach caliper, like body fat methods, and I think it's become obvious to me that many of these things are not useful in the gym. And I'm not saying that, for example, getting someone's blood pressure, like it's a valuable number, but here's the reality of it. You're not a medical professional, right? You can take their blood pressure. You can't tell them they have high blood pressure. Like, it's not within your scope, nor is it a representation, right? If they're taking their blood pressure multiple times at a doctor's office, that's what I would want to know. So a lot of it ends up being, for me, application of this stuff. I think it's good to know how to take how to take someone's blood pressure, the difference between systolic and diastolic. I'm more interested in the tests and exams they're getting from their doctor, and I'm making sure they're doing them. And then I want to make sure like I can have conversations about it and know like, okay, if their blood pressure is at this level, I understand that that's like, like borderline hypertensive, and like what do the doctors say? And we should have some conversations about habit change. But having to do it, I don't think is valuable. So there's some stuff in there. I'm not going to go into all of it, but I think as you read through, kind of identify like which ones can I actually do, like, or should I do in the gym? Like, which one should a doctor do and which one should personal trainer do, because I think there's some things in here that need to change in the industry as far as how we're doing it. But either way, be familiar with the Part Q, because this stratifies risk of cardiovascular issue. It's the absolute minimum you should be doing. You can download some forms in that link inside the study guide, so you can use those bad boys, and then have recognition level knowledge of some of these other assessments I'm talking about, like heart rate, blood pressure, circumference measurements, which I have a tape measure literally in my backpack right now. I love circumference measurements. They are very useful and very motivating to a lot of people, and much easier to get good at, right? Learning like the caliper methods, like the skin fold measurements that are mentioned inside the chapter, although it's a cool skill to have, most people are wildly inaccurate at it, and it's probably not even worth doing. Like the amount of energy and time you have to put into learning how to do it appropriately, it's probably not worth the payoff, especially with other alternatives out there like bioelectrical impedance, in-body. They have their sources of error, but they're very convenient for people to do. And a lot of gyms have them these days, so I think it's great. And there's some good info that comes out of it. But I like circumference measurements because it's very easy, right? It's very non-invasive for me to measure, measure someone's chest, measure their arms, measure their waist, right? Waist-to-hip ratio, waist, hips, thighs. And the truth is a lot of times, we all know, weight's not always going to change. That can be a motivating one, right? To see, all right, maybe our weight stayed similar, but still in the first 6 weeks, you lost 6 inches. That's huge, right? We want to have things to track. So that's a great one, very easy to do. Some of the others are not feasible, in my opinion, like some of the other body fat composition methods, but just be familiar with them. And then have basic knowledge, right? Don't go super deep, but just like know what the test does. That's all I would be worried about doing. Basic knowledge of the cardiorespiratory assessments, like what is the VO2 max, what is the Rockport walk test, what does it test for, YMCA step test, talk test, all those. So just basic recognition level knowledge. And if you really want to focus on the one I think is probably the most applicable to actually training clients and doing well, is spend some time with the talk test, right? Spend some time with the talk test, because that one actually can be pretty useful figuring out where to start people out. All right, so chapter 11. And then chapter 12 is where we get into movement and performance assessments, all right? So this starts a little bit, some of it's like static posture, which is great because if you want to have a good understanding of exercise technique and movement mechanics, right? Static posture, right? How someone holds themselves. It's like every exercise, every movement has to have kind of like a basis in which to receive forces. And so the static posture can give us some good information just about how their body might be receiving forces based on how they move or how they're built, because all those things come into it. So it's not that you're meant inside this chapter, and this is where people kind of go down one path or the other. We're not trying to be physical therapists. We're not trying to fix everybody. But if we can get more information that allows us to make better exercise selection, and if we can help people move better and feel better, boom, you can't put a price on that. That I can tell you is that if you can get people moving better, feeling better, and also seeing like their other physical goals, they will never leave you and they will pay whatever you charge, because so many people are walking around just living with normal pain and issues and stuff too. So again, we're not here to fix people, but you can usually do some good just by taking the right approach to people. So understand how to perform the static postural assessment. You guys can watch the video for a detailed breakdown on our YouTube channel. Know what to look for. Also be able to recognize some of the postural syndromes they talk about in here, pes planus, lower cross and upper cross. You need to know those. You need to know what are the likely overactive, underactive muscles. That stuff's gonna come back up on your exam. Also, develop a comfort, because so much is encompassed in it with the overhead squat. Again, you guys can find detailed video on here, but this is a memorization level one. You should know inside and out. I know the primary overactive, the primary underactive for all the checkpoints, right? Toes turn out, knees cave in, torso comes forward, shoulders fall forward, all of it. You should know the overactive and underactive. Easy questions to get right or wrong. And again, it's just gonna, even like your mastery of that, it will help you in some other things here on the exam. It's gonna make sure you know muscular anatomy as well. And then I would say, be familiar with, but spend less time. So I would spend more time on the overhead squat, and then just be familiar with, again, understand push-pull assessment, single leg squat assessment. Single leg squat's pretty easy because it's kind of encompassed in the other ones as well. But there's some good stuff on there. You guys are gonna wanna be familiar with those. All right, so that's chapters 11 and 12. The assessment piece, again, not as important. Again, they're all important, right? Everything can be on the test and on the exam, but as we make our way back to, which I'll do quickly, make our way back to our CPT exam blueprint, right? We went through chapters 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and each of those are like decent little components, but none of them are quite weighted as heavily as sections 5 and 6. So the stuff that we're gonna get into now, which is like exercise technique, training instruction, and then also program design, which is great because day to day, this is most of what you're gonna be doing. Your knowledge and your higher level understanding of these other concepts will make you better at sections 5 and 6, but most of what you'll be doing day to day is going to be section 5 and 6 type information. And I can tell you lots and lots of exam questions. 45% of your exam alone comes from these sections. So let's jump right back in to section 5, exercise technique and instruction. This is where, and this is obviously, even in some of our other material you guys find here on YouTube, we've talked about just the value of mastering the OPT model and really knowing all the different phases, what your goals are, what the variables look like, what reps and sets look like. You're gonna wanna do that because that is not only covered a lot, especially in section 6, right, in chapters like 20, 21, but your knowledge of that will help you better understand everything in section 5. Because as we get into these other pieces, right, you get into flexibility, you get into plyometric, you get into balance training, it's all phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 is like, it's like stabilization, strength, power. There's phases to what we're doing in this training. So OPT model is really the center of all this. And so again, chapter 13 starts to dive back in or into some of this stuff too. We actually talk about it really early on in our courses because I know this is foundational stuff that is going to build on for all your practical training. So if you're early on in your study process, don't hesitate to like get into some of the OPT model stuff first, or watch some of our videos where we break it down for you guys too. So basic understanding, inside of chapter 13, you have a basic understanding of the benefits of each of these components of the integrated training model, flexibility, core, cardio. They talk through some of this in the chapters. This is like, I think, light reading material early on in chapter 13, and then have a strong working knowledge of the OPT model and the acute variables, all right? So we have a detailed video breakdown here on YouTube, and there's also another shorter video you guys can access. So this one, again, this is like introduction to everything else that's coming. So chapter 13, you know, out of all the chapters, it's not the one I'm going to go back and memorize the most, but again, make sure you're paying attention, you're reading through, and you're paying attention to what goes into the integrated training model. And then as we get into it, the cool thing is the way that the chapters are oriented are not oriented in the way that like you have to only focus on flexibility before you focus on cardiovascular, but they do focus on more foundational concepts and pieces first, right? I mean, as we're thinking about some of our goals in the OPT model in stabilization endurance, like this foundation, well, some of it's going to be like mobility, flexibility, getting people moving better, right? Starting to set the foundation for movement so that as we start to increase and advance our other variables like loads and reps and sets and challenging exercises, they're already moving well enough where they get the most out of it. So flexibility training concepts, this is one where much like everything else inside the material, again, a lot of terms tied in, so feel free to review the flashcards, but know what factors they talk about in the material, know what factors impact flexibility, as well as the role, right, that it plays in developing muscular imbalances. So it's all kind of tied together, right? Understanding as we looked at some of the information in assessment, right, and looking for movement issues, imbalances, overactive, underactive, now it's kind of like, what do I do about it? So I've identified these things, and now as we get into the rest of the material, it's like, how do I improve it? Okay, I'm not here to fix people because some things may not be fixable, but how can I focus on that? So flexibility inside here, you know, they talk about the benefits of myofascial release and foam rolling, which you'll find in all 3 phases of flexibility training. And then I would also pay real specific attention to the examples they give you, right? As you look at chapters 14 through 20, these different like parts of this integrated training model, they're going to give you some very specific examples of phase 1, of phase 2, of phase 3 progressions. And it's the NASM exam, so it's only going to behoove you to pay attention to those. Those will definitely come up as exam questions, and some of them are very specific. They're like materials that, you know, you may have a good understanding of plyometric training, but if you didn't pay attention to some of the variables given in there, you know, as far as working like plyometric training with youth versus an adult population, those are easy ones to get right or wrong, and so you're just going to want to pay attention. There's a lot that comes inside of some of these chapters, but this is where some of your information and knowledge regarding terms like reciprocal inhibition, synergistic dominance, neuromuscular efficiency, you know, those terms will definitely come up, and they're related heavily to some of the concepts inside of flexibility training. All right, so be familiar with those. Also, again, coming back to, I mentioned this earlier in the video, we're already here into flexibility training, is be familiar with the role that the muscle spindles and the Golgi tendon organs play in regulating what we perceive as flexibility, because for a lot of people, that's what it is, right? Your body's great at like holding on to things to protect you, right? If you had a previous back or hip issue, your body might be holding on somewhere, right? Those hamstrings might not just be tight, they might be holding on to try to stabilize your hips and your pelvis and your spine because something else isn't doing it. And so muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs play a role there. And then just review the chapter examples like I mentioned. Pay attention to those, because even some of the terms or some of the names of exercises as you get into different stretches and even core exercises, they're specific to NASM and you might not have heard it before. So review those bad boys. There's a lot that starts to come from these chapters, all right? Cardiorespiratory fitness. Like I mentioned earlier, I love the energy system stuff. Cardiorespiratory fitness doesn't get a lot of love. You know, the industry is very much about strength training, which is great. I mean, this is where a lot of people's body composition change and aesthetic changes are going to happen through resistance training. But let's not forget the fact that cardiorespiratory fitness is massively important for long-term health. And if you want to, address it and progress it appropriately, I think NASM actually does a pretty good job of laying out for you like the different zone model of cardiovascular training. And again, it all kind of goes back to, if you think about the OPT model, even with strength training, like we set a foundation, we progress it, and then there's the highest levels of progression. Well, cardiovascular system is very much the same. Initially, we're building that cardiovascular base, right? More of that zone 1 training for an extended period of time, 30 minutes to be able to maintain zone 1, before we start to introduce zone 2 intervals. And even those initial intervals are aerobic, right? And we got a lot of recovery time. Bring it up for a minute, bring it back down for 3 minutes. And then we start to get into zone 3 and zone 4, right? And that kind of gets up to that higher intensity level. But the idea is we want to set that foundation first. So I think this is actually a really great chapter. Pay attention to some of the images in here. Just know the general guidelines, like table 15-1 is a good one to review as you guys are studying. You know, have basic recall understanding of how to assign exercise intensities, because there's different ways of us looking at it, right? There's the RPE method versus using heart rate as a measure of intensity, and all of them have value. You know, be familiar with the Tanaka and the Carbonin formulas that they give you in there. Chances of you having to calculate one of those is low, but benefit could be there. So, you know, pay attention to those, could come up, but probably unlikely for you to, you know, obsess about only memorizing those equations versus knowing, you know, what we're trying to accomplish and why those equations have become more popular as a great means of like really finding like heart rate reserve and actually programming, if you're going to program cardiovascular training, which some trainers do, some trainers don't. But if you do more of it, this is a really great chapter to better understand heart rate zones and how that relates to progression over time. So spend some additional time reading the stage training content in here and the example workouts, because they do give you guys some example workouts. So pay attention to those. I think they actually do a pretty good job inside of that chapter, especially relative to the way things were laid out previously. All right, so moving on, core training concepts. And again, there's not a ton of bullet points on here. This is one where from a training standpoint, man, I love this stuff. Everyone loves core, and it's honestly probably one of the most misunderstood areas of the body as well, like what is really involved in the core. But NASM does a pretty good job of kind of expanding that view for you guys. You definitely want to know what muscles are involved in the local and the global core systems, right? Table 16-1 gives you guys that information. Understanding all the ones that are local. You know, local is more about stabilization, segmental stabilization of the spine. You know, things like our pelvic floor, our transverse abdominis, our diaphragm, you know, our multifidus, some of these smaller muscles in the back. You know, these ones are ones that are going to be more in that local, and then our global, which span into like larger muscles, ones that we think of as the core, like our rectus abdominis, our internal external obliques. You know, getting into those other muscles, right? Our rectus femoris, our hip flexors, our glutes, our lats. A lot of muscles that most people don't think of as core muscles. So from a training standpoint, that's great. From an exam standpoint, you definitely are going to want to know where they fit in inside of those different categories. And then from that, also, just like the rest of the chapters here, and we're looking into section 5, be familiar with the progressions, because they give you some examples, which I think does two things. First off, easy to get your exam questions right. Know what the exercise examples are with your level 1, your level 2, your level 3 progressions, because pretty much there's stabilization core exercises, there's strength core exercises, and then they give you power core exercises. So that's the OPT model coming back again. But be familiar with those because they're going to come up on the exam. And honestly, if you actually are familiar and you try some of these moves, this is going to be good for you as you start training people, because most people jump right into level 2 progressions, like moving core exercises, without enough focus on stabilization, you know, and just teaching the pelvis, the hips, the core, all these core systems to control and to stabilize first. It's mostly isometric stuff, all right? So review those, understand the 3 levels of core training, and then if you really want some great information here too, Dr. Stu McGill, this is just an extra video we included in here when it comes to core stability training. You should check out Dr. Stu McGill's Big 3. There's a ton of great videos out there on YouTube. Obviously, we've got a great one, but any of them that you look up are going to be good to teach you those three. Those are three that a lot of people should be doing. All right, so core training, lots of good stuff. Make sure you review level 1, level 2, level 3 progressions. Know the differences between them, what categorizes an exercise that way, and then also know your local and your global core systems. That's your primary stuff inside of there. All right, easy enough, right? And then chapter 17, balance training. This is great too, because again, you think about like things that are kind of prerequisites for one another. Focusing on, this is one reason, you don't only have to do core and balance training for people initially, like we're still gonna be, even for our stabilization level 1 clients, we're still gonna be doing squatting, lunging, pushing, pulling, like our movement patterns, but the benefit of focusing on like especially some stabilization level core training is it will improve balance. It's gonna help you engage the right muscles, and that's gonna help us as we progress our balance training. So all these things add to each other. That's why it's like this integrated training model is like, it's like this feed forward system where if I'm training this and then I progress this and this and this, and I'm doing all these over time, it's just gonna build this like beautiful, capable body that we know so many people wanna have. All right, so chapter 17, balance training concepts. This is another area that's kind of either misunderstood or just misapplied for a lot of people. But things for you guys to know, understanding balance training centers around challenging our ability to maintain center of gravity over our base of support. That's really all it is over time, progression of balance training is always, it's just understanding that if I have a bigger base of support, right, wider base of support, or if I'm lying on the ground, I'm gonna be more stable. It's gonna be easier to balance. The smaller, the narrower my base of support is, right, from here to single leg, to true single leg, right, the more challenging it's gonna be. That's gonna be progression of our center of gravity over our base of support. So that's one piece. And for a lot of people, I would say application-wise, there's a lot to be done to improve balance on the ground without changing surfaces. And inside your material, you should be familiar with the suggested progressions. NASM talks about going from flat ground to doing balance exercises on a balance beam, to doing them on a half foam roll. You should be familiar with that progression because that often comes up on the exam questions. But I think also from a coaching standpoint, don't go to those things first. Most people have a lot of benefit to be had truly by just training on the ground. And the other surfaces sometimes can be so unstable, they're not getting as much out of it. So even just thinking, doing more split stance training, I'm telling you guys, can be a magical key to like improving people's balance and engagement and stability while you're doing your other compound movements, and not just spending 30 minutes doing balance training for most clients who that's not what they're coming in for. But either way, some good stuff inside of here. Understand the difference between, they talk about static, semi-dynamic, and dynamic balance challenges. This is kind of nuanced, but chances are training, right, you're gonna end up working with a 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, like aging population. And over time, like this stuff is a lot easier to improve and work on when you're in your 30s and 40s. So even if you're not working with 60, 70, 80-year-old clients, where this is obviously a huge piece, balance and fall prevention, little doses of it along the way can make sure we're maintaining it for people. And they do a pretty cool job of showing you. There's just so much that goes into it, different levels, right? Because we obviously have our internal mechanisms, we have our inner ear organ, we have proprioception. There's a lot of systems that work together to help maintain balance, but they're all trainable, right? So they're all trainable. Understand the impact of balance training. They talk a little bit in here about injury, rehab, performance, and just the research out there on balance training and how it all relates. And then as far as like actual tables to review 17-4 and be familiar with the 3 levels of progression, just like the other stuff, right? Level 1, level 2, level 3 progressions for balance training, because this will fit kind of with our OPT model. And the cool thing is, right, this is good examples given on pages 557 to 567. If you guys are in the 7th edition, like I am, and this video is for, is you're going from like more isometrics, right, so more control, to a little bit more movement, prime movement, and balancing with like bigger joints moving, and then you're going to more power. And this actually ends up being balance training. This is why balance training is kind of the prerequisite to more athletic modes like SAQ and plyometric training, because as you start to get into, we'll see in the next chapter, we get into plyometric training, level 1 progression of plyometric training kind of looks like level 3 progression of balance training. So they kind of like blend in together. That's the cool thing. All right, so your takeaway on those as you get into those two, right, level 1 balance training is going to be all about, right, you're manipulating other things, maybe other variables, looking, change of direction, whatever, but you're really not moving the primary stance leg. It's all about challenges to that. Maybe you're tossing and catching a medicine ball. The moment we go into level 2 progressions, now we're actually moving, right, primary joints. So rather than just doing balance work here, now I'm actually going through like hinging, lunging, more motion in that stance leg. That's going to be the next level. So you'll see some of the progressions there that match up with that. And then the third is where we start to actually like leave the ground now, because it becomes progressively a lot more challenging. You know, over time I build up strength here, and then by the time I get to level 3 progressions, now I'm leaving the ground and then just trying to absorb those forces and improve my balance. Because the cool thing is like when you get good there, then by the time you really start doing and attacking plyometric training, you're gonna be already set up better to focus on those landing mechanics, which is what we do early on and initially. All right, so some really good stuff there inside of balance training. So pay attention to those, and just pay attention to the level 1, 2, 3 progressions in all these chapters, because they're 100% gonna come up on your guys' exam and materials. All right, so speaking of plyometrics, we got a little box here, little box jumps. Popular exercise is knowing the 3 phases of plyometric exercises, all right, and the stretch shortening cycle. So this meaning like knowing, right, knowing that we have this amortization phase, right? We have this rapid eccentric component. We have the amortization phase, which is the amount of time that it takes to go from eccentric to concentric. And then we have a concentric contraction, right? So it's this rapid stretch shortening cycle to make something plyometric. And this is why the material also refers to reactive, because plyometric is, as we all know it, plyometric is more like impact plows, or more thinking like ground contact or foot contact with the ground. Reactive, though, has plyometric elements. For example, if I were to do a kettlebell swing, I'm not leaving the ground, but I do have some similar components where there's a rapid stretch shortening cycle that happens, and so there's some similar characteristics to it as well, right? Obviously, impact is different with plyometrics, but reactive is a good term to still describe some of the same things. So you want to know these 3 phases of the plyometric exercises, understand the stretch shortening cycle and how to apply it. Table 18-1 is great for this, so refer to table 18-1 inside your guys' actual chapter and inside your materials. And then also get familiar with the plyometric training guidelines. And this one is actually pretty specific. As you look at some of the different populations they talk about with plyometric training, even SAQ training in the next chapter, just review, right? Review some of the differences of like working with youth versus working with like general population weight loss versus elderly clients, because the reality is these all have benefit for all populations, but how we apply it is gonna end up being very different, and it's probably gonna look a lot different as well. All right, so be familiar with those guidelines in that 18-2, and then also understand the differences between those 3 levels of progression with the plyometrics. Again, great examples. Be familiar with the examples that they've given here, right? There's images, there's pictures, there's level 1, 2, 3 progressions. Definitely review those. Your simplified, like my dumbed down explanation of it for you guys is phase 1 is all going to be about more absorption and mechanics. So you'll find, just like we do eccentrics and isometrics in resistance training for stage 1 in the OPT model, you do the same thing with plyometrics. So, because that's the problem. Most people don't have too much of an issue, even like youth and kids. They can figure out how to jump, but it's the landing component we need to solidify first. So oftentimes it's going to be like isometric holds in our landing positions. And then that's level 1 type stuff, right, with some variations and direction change. Level 2 is now going to be, now I'm going to start to string a few of them together, right? Because now my ability to do so as I transition, I'm still not maximal intensity, but try to maintain good position with multiple reps, and I start to introduce in level 2 maybe some different directions. And then level 3 is generally going to be more with like max effort, all right? So review those. Those are easy ones to get right or wrong in the exam. And truthfully, again, here's another area where a lot of people don't really understand the demands that plyometric training, places on the body. It's a very advanced, especially like rapid, high speed, like jumping type activities. Things like, and I'm probably gonna mess up my mic here too, but things like tuck jumps. I mean, those are gonna be like your level 3 progressions. And it's not uncommon to see things like that and like, other types of box jumps thrown in for group workouts and clients who just aren't there yet. So not only if you wanna keep people safe, you want to make sure you're progressing appropriately, but also just if you want them to get more out of it down the road from an athletic standpoint, the variables in here are great. And what will be surprising to you, especially with our plyometric and even the SAQ, is the volume. Meaning that for most people, this stuff is not about doing like 5 sets of like 20, 30 reps. It's like less volume, more high quality, because a lot of these things, initially we've got to build up. Plyometrics can be great for building up connective tissue strength, all right? But it takes time. We don't want to injure those tissues in the process. So you have to start just slowly introducing. And that's one reason why if you follow this 3-stage model with some of these things, it can be a great way of thinking about how to make sure you're progressing slowly over time and just introducing those right variables. All right, so chapter 18, great stuff. Plyometric training, I think, is important for lots of people, elderly clients, everything. So it's all about building integrity, great for bone mineral density. And honestly, if we don't maintain, if we don't use our fast twitch muscle fibers, you end up losing them over time. So as we think about it, power training, SAQ, plyometric might look a little different for your 16-year-old athlete versus your 60-year-old client, but massive value no matter what, massive value. All right, guys, and we're crushing right now. We're already on chapter 19. I'm gonna reiterate my same concept was in these chapters all the way from 19 into 20, review the examples, level 1, 2, 3 progressions, SAQ. They give you just, again, inside this chapter, they also give you some examples of like different drills to do, but have a basic understanding of the difference, right? The definition difference of speed versus agility versus quickness. And usually the confusion can happen with agility and quickness. Even sometimes the NASM like definitions and terminology, it's kind of hard to differentiate the two, right? Speed is more linear, agility, change of direction. Really it comes down to like quickness is like even higher level. There's more decision making and even more thought process that has to happen versus just change of direction, because they're very similar but a little different. So pay attention to the way NASM describes those definitions, because that's stuff that's likely to come up and sneak up on you. Easy to get right, easy to get wrong. All right, browse the discussion of SAQ for non-athletic populations, and they give you, like I said, some specific variables for youth, weight loss, seniors, and I would actually review. In there they give you some tables too, because those are pretty common ones you'll see as you're taking the quizzes on chapter 19, and you take the section 5 quiz. You'll see that kind of stuff coming up. So review some of those tables, just be familiar. That way, as you're on there, you can kind of at least have recognition level, like, ooh, I remember that sounds right, 2 sets of however many repetitions of a drill. And they give you guys some good examples in there too. All right, so don't give it tons and tons of study time, but do review specifically table 19-3 for some good basic program design direction. All right, and then guys, we are on to chapter 20, and I know we're spending some time here together. All right, I appreciate it, and more so, I appreciate you spending some time really like dialing in on what you guys need to know. Hopefully this has been helpful at some point. If it has been, then do me a favor so far. If you're already like, gosh, this is great, narrowing down some information, do me a favor, please go on right now, boom, right below this video, hit the like button, subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't already, and if you haven't downloaded the study guide, then definitely do that, because beyond this video, it's going to be a great resource for you to come back to this stuff without having to dive back into this video and listen to me talk even more. You guys can just find it on there. But we're on chapter 20, resistance training concept. This I find from teaching, again, we've been running courses and programs since 2015. We've worked with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of students from around the world. Resistance training tends to be more of the area of comfort. Like a lot of people getting into personal training, either they like strength training or they feel like they know a little bit more about it. But I think dialing into some of these variables is going to be really helpful, because a lot of people end up training really just in like maybe 2 of the zones more than anything. More like in this muscular development, maybe a little bit of strength based on your person. So either way, a lot of great stuff in here. Terms that you guys should be familiar with and just understand. First off, general adaptation syndrome, GAS. Understand what it is, what it describes, right? The alarm reaction phase, our resistance development, exhaustion, and then also like what role does that play? Because this really starts to set the stage for the reason behind programming, right? Programming being like the strategic and purposeful manipulation of stressors over time. That's really what programming is, right? We manipulate these variables to increase and introduce a new stressor to the body, and then allow it time to evolve and adapt and recover, so that next time we do it, it's no longer a stressor, and we continue to do that over time. Right? But understanding these variables can be helpful, because again, it's the idea of like, it really ends up being somewhat of this like art form. There's some real good standards out there, but also it's just like getting to know the person and the real life that they live in to know when you got to push and when you got to pull back and when you need to change certain variables you had planned for that day. Because as you'll find when you get here in this environment with real people, a lot of the stuff right out here where people are coming in with like real stress and real lives and kids and whatever and being sick, is a lot of times your variables end up changing a lot from what you read inside the textbook. But either way, it's a great chapter. No general adaptation syndrome. Also, SAID principle, specific adaptation to impose demands. And then be familiar with the different types of specificity they talk about, right? More energy system related, more mechanical. These end up being important. And they're easier to apply, I think, when you're thinking about and you're talking about athletes. But they do play a role, especially also with general population. And the takeaway is like, making sure that as you look at your program, your training, your exercise selection, all these variables, that they match, right? These different types of specificity, they match up with what we're trying to improve. That's kind of the lens that we're looking at here. Feel free to revisit the OPT model video that we have on the channel as well. And then I would have some, at least like some pretty decent level, call it memorization level, or at least like great recall of the acute variables and suggestions relative to the OPT phases. This you can find in table 20-3. And honestly, chapters 20 and chapters 21 are some areas that like I would really actually go through and like take some good notes, do even more in-depth reading than you might normally do. Because there's just so much that comes from this, and they want you to know it, guys. That's the one thing you got to keep in mind. NASM wants you to pass. Like, the information is there, and the stuff that we get into with like chapter 20, 21, we really get into, I think, what makes NASM, which is like application of the OPT model and the variables involved. So go through table 20-3. That's a great one for memorizing the variables as they fit into these different phases. Also, the different resistance training systems they talk about in 20-5. And then, truthfully, the progressions and examples on pages 636 through 671. I know this is like a decent little chunk of the textbook, but I would pay attention. I would review those because, again, they're ones that, for one, they just might give you some great insight and some great ideas with training. Maybe there's some exercises and stuff you've never done before, but also going to give you some good insight into what NASM wants you to know. So, rocking and rolling, guys. Here we are. We are getting into our final section of this lengthy but comprehensive, right? Really diving into all the major components and concepts that you need to know for the NASM exam. All right, so section 6, program design. Now again, all this, these were like these different variables, the OPT model, different styles of training, everything else. And now in section 6, it starts to become more about like, how do I start to put it all together? Which is good because this is where we now need to be thinking. You're gonna go off after you guys are certified, start working with clients, and of course, you're going to have a lot of information you remember. Some of it you might forget momentarily. But then what's going to come out is it's going to be like, okay, how do I put workouts together? How do I take the knowledge that I've learned and like start to apply that stuff? So I even have here on the screen, you guys can see, NASM's got some decent forms and pages for helping you guys start to understand programming, periodization, and even just like structuring workouts intelligently, which I think is a great place for people to start making sure even your order of operations in a workout makes sense. Because for a lot of people, they might not, right? Like if you're doing, you're going through, maybe you do a warm-up, you do strength training, and then you do a bunch of like plyometric work at the end. Well, truthfully, right, you can see it on the sheet and the industry standard. Truthfully, that's not the most effective nor the safest method of training for most people, although it's widely common, right? You can probably think about like, man, I see people doing like box jumps at the end of their workout. Well, truthfully, plyometric and power training, it's a neurological component. There's a higher risk to reward ratio. So you really want to do that like after you've warmed up, before you've gone and trained heavily with whatever you're doing, if you want to get the biggest benefit out of it. All right, so that's a whole nother. We could have a whole video on here just on that. But there's some great stuff in here. So chapter 21, the OPT model. Check out figure 21-1. Keep this one in mind when it comes to understanding your programming principles. Have a basic understanding of just the programming terminology. They talk about mesocycles, microcycles, macrocycles. Just how you take a look at programming from like a big picture, like, hey, what are my primary goals in this next 6 months? How do I start to narrow that down to like, okay, over these first 3 months, here's what I'll do. The second 3 months, kind of here's what I'll do. And then narrowing that down into months and weeks. Because obviously you're going to start out from like bigger things like strength, capacities, whatever phase of training I might want to be in, like these different variables. And then, again, we end up breaking it down all the way to, the actual exercises that we choose and progress it over time. So either way, there's a lot in here, some great stuff. Make sure you know the terminology surrounding those. Be able to differentiate and understand the difference between linear and undulating periodization approach. This can be, challenging and confusing for some because now, the OPT model as it exists, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, 4, 5, if you spend 3 to 6 weeks on each of those phases, and that's the main focus, and then you move on, build that up and then move on, build that up and then move on, which is kind of how it's presented, is more of a linear approach. And that, even a lot of the research they don't talk about inside the material, is a very effective approach, linear type approach for beginners to intermediate, right, especially to setting the foundation. And what you find further down the road is there's a lot of research that shows from like muscular development and performance that once someone is like intermediate to advanced, and it's hard to say exactly what that is, but further down the road with experience, that doing an undulating approach, which means like rather than just focus on stabilization for 4 to 6 weeks, I might have like somewhat of like a stabilization and muscular endurance focus on Monday, and then when we train on Wednesday, maybe we're more like hypertrophy muscular development, and then when we train on Friday, maybe it's like just like some strength and power stuff. All right, so again, I'm hitting these different variables in a given week, and what you'll find is like that can be a great way at still making progress. And for a lot of clients, you'll find, especially in the general gym setting, changing some of those variables once they're further along, right? You've been training for a year or two or more. it can also make it like really like refreshing and exciting, right? It's like the workout, even if you didn't do that much different with your exercises, but the different variables, you know, I'm coming in with more of like a stabilization, muscular endurance. I'm doing like 15, 20, 25 reps of an exercise for 2 sets one day, and then I'm coming in on Wednesday and I'm doing more like, you know, 3 to 4 sets of like 10 to 12. So I think experientially it can be great, but there's also a lot of great research behind it as well. So know and understand the difference between those 2 types of training. Be able to recognize, so I get practice using the OPT model template. Yeah, so outside of that too, I mean, start to print off. Some of these documents are free on the NASM website. If you guys scroll all the way down to the NASM website, and you guys will see like resources, documents you can download. You can get all this stuff on here, these OPT training templates, and start to use them, right? And they're ordered in a way that you don't have to do, right? You don't have to do you know, balance training and plyometric and SAQ and core like in every one session. But if you were going to, the order they have them on there is probably the most intelligent to get the most out of it. All right, so again, take it and use it, make it your own. Be able to recognize, NASM also just introduces this concept of like 6 fundamental movement patterns. You know, so that's not a bad thing. Again, be familiar with those. And then also be able to match the acute variable ranges with the various levels of the OPT model. This one will be mostly, if you guys pay attention and really make sure you understand and know, pages 688 to 711, right? And this is there's a lot of variables in there. Don't memorize every single chart, but you know, like go through, spend some extra time going through those pages, because I can tell you from an exam standpoint, that stuff will come up in some way. And again, I think coaching and training standpoint, it can be some really good stuff for you to be using and applying once you're past this whole certification thing, all right? So chapter 1, OPT model. And then, boom, you guys see on here too. Yeah, this is that table. I actually included in our study guide because I thought it was that valuable. Table 21-3. This is one you guys should go check out, look up, and use from a study standpoint. All right, as we get into, guys, our last 2 chapters, right? Last 2 chapters of the material. Honestly, we've made it through at this point in time. I think the most heavily weighted and the most important stuff as far as being a great coach and trainer. But last 2 chapters, some good stuff in here. Chapter 22, really, if I had to simplify it down into one thing, is it's like knowing what tool to use for the job. They introduce a lot of different like exercise equipment and different types of training in here. The difference between free weights and bands and cables and machines and you know, battle ropes and kettlebells and all this stuff, right? The cool thing is there's like endless toys out there. And having a little familiarity with each of these is going to be great because it's going to make you a versatile coach and trainer. But I think the big thing to take away here too is be smart, paying attention to some of the benefits and differences. You're going to find certain tools are just great for certain things, right? Like TRX you might find like you really love because of the usefulness of it. You really like using the TRX for things like bodyweight rows and curls and stretching, right? So you're going to find you end up using certain tools for certain things. This chapter does a decent job of introducing some of them if you're not familiar with them already. But do pay attention to the discussion of risk to reward ratio, because I think this is huge in the gym environment, of making sure that the risk to reward ratio is in the client's favor, right? Because sometimes as coaches and trainers, it's pretty easy, right, in the Instagram circus that is the fitness industry to just be throwing in like crazy different tools all the time because you think like you need to change it up every time you're in the workout, which truthfully you don't. Although people like doing new things, but they don't necessarily need to do everything 100% new all the time. It's not a great approach towards making progress, you know, but just be smart about how you introduce things, because there is a risk component, and when they're training with you, like, you're responsible for them. So if you use a tool in a way it's not meant to be used, industry standards, scope of practice, like legal world is going to say like you were at fault. For example, if I use a bench to do a step up on and someone falls, right? It sounds silly because a lot of people use benches and a lot of them are sturdy, but if I do that, they guarantee you on the warning sign underneath of that bench, it says not meant to be stood on, right? So you just want to be smart about those things. My mind's always on the legal liability standpoint, partially because I just don't want people to get hurt. I want to take care of them. I want them to get in great shape and not get hurt in the process. All right, so browse and review. I wouldn't spend a ton of time on chapter 22, but just browse and review some of the pros and cons presented inside of the chapter relative to different like training modalities. Less likely to be a lot of exam questions, but just I think a good opportunity to get outside of your normal training methods and expand your toolbox, because that's going to be really helpful when it comes to working with a diverse set of clients, which you're going to end up doing as you guys are getting started. All right, and then chapter 23. Chapter 23 is almost like a little bit of a disservice because there's just so many different like health conditions and special populations that are kind of introduced in here, and you're given some information, but there's no way you're going to memorize it all. And I'll give you guys my take on this. So first off, covers a lot of ground, so don't be overwhelmed with full memorization. I don't think it's necessary, even from an exam standpoint. I think, again, just browse, be familiar, read, but I wouldn't be reading this chapter multiple times trying to memorize all of the different frequencies, intensities, types, and everything else that's there. Because the cool thing is when you're working with these people, these different populations in real life, as a coach and trainer, you're gonna have time, right? You're gonna go spend time saying, hey, guess what? I'm working with a woman, she's, in her second trimester of pregnancy. Gosh, I need to make sure, let me go look up some of the most recent stuff on contraindications. And so there's some things in the chapter, but don't expect this to be your end-all, be-all resource. I still have it all the time when I run into someone with a specific injury, issue, condition, whatever it might be. You're just gonna spend time making sure that your plan matches that person and communicating appropriately. So browse through these things. They all are very important. And it's also important too to be able to identify people that fall into these categories, because when it comes to not only stuff inside of chapter 11, when we're talking about risk stratification and getting in the information when someone first gets started, but also even as we get into thinking about nutrition, right? As the nutrition side of things. The state of Florida is an interesting one where we're able to do quite a bit as personal trainers, more so than other states, meaning the state legislature supports us doing some behavioral nutrition coaching, basic information. But if someone is a special population or considered one of these specific conditions, then it's gonna be something you're gonna want, for their own benefit, you're gonna wanna refer out to a dietitian or nutritionist anyways, but also from a liability standpoint for you. So again, not one I'm gonna dive into a lot. One thing you'll find, if you pay attention to some of the exercise prescriptions and recommendations for these different age groups, populations, conditions, the one thing that you'll find is that you're gonna find a greater emphasis on starting slow, progressing slowly, more warm-ups, less intensity. I know that's a very broad generalization, but that's gonna be kind of your safest approach. And that's actually one of the reasons why I think the OPT model can be a great method of learning, training initially, because it does focus you on this stabilization level, slow entry into, right? We've got time. Be patient as a coach. Most people are looking for that as well. Every once in a while you run into an inpatient client who's yeah, I want to jump right into the hard stuff, and you'll deal with that. But a lot of people are okay. They want to be taken care of. They don't want to get hurt in the process either. So take this chapter with a grain of salt, pay attention, but just know as you encounter these individuals out in your training life and world, which you will, it's great, you're gonna help so many people down the road, is you're gonna have to spend some more time, looking up newer information, because some of these things change as well. All right, so guys, that was chapters 1 through chapter 23. I know we've been on here for quite some time. Hopefully that's helped you guys at least bullet point. I know it's a super quick, there's no way, if you guys are studying for your exam, gosh, you're definitely gonna have to spend more time than just this video, right? But hopefully this video helps to highlight the things that you guys need to know, and hopefully it's even more reason for you guys to get your hands on the study guide and use this as a study tool, right? Because after teaching these courses for NASM specifically since 2015, retaking the exam, I'm constantly trying to figure out and hone in on okay, where's the stuff that we can kind of set off? Because some stuff you're learning inside the material in the book, it's important, but it might not be important right now, right? So here's the stuff you're gonna be tested on most. And then obviously we talked a little bit in the video too, just things that are probably gonna be more applicable as you make your way through, all right? So if you guys enjoyed this video, you guys want more resources like this, then don't forget, like the video, leave a comment, leave any questions you guys have, go into the description, download the study guide. We've also got a couple other links for you guys as well if you guys have interest in joining the Facebook group, just getting some additional support. We just want more people like you, because I know so many people give up in this process, because as we went through, this is overwhelming 300 pages of deep science. The good thing is if you're watching this video right now, you're all the way at the end, that already sets you apart. It already sets you apart. It means you really want to do well with what you're doing. You want to learn and you want to do things right way. And we just want more people like you guys to get into the industry, because I know there's so many people that fail out in the process because they don't have the right support or even just the right structure and view. So hopefully this, guys, helps you along the way. Don't just try to read this bad boy cover to cover. It's probably going to be a losing strategy. And if you guys want some additional action items for you as well, you guys will find as you guys download this little resource, we just have some other things in here you guys can refer back to. And for any of you guys, even if you just want to jump on, talk about material, talk about your study process, talk about the industry at large. I just love talking all things fitness. And so we do also offer up the opportunity to jump on any type of free 15 to 20 minute coaching call. So you guys can find a link to that here in the description. Also, you guys will see it inside of the study download. But I'm gonna go, boom, study guide away. And this is really what it's all about, guys. I know right now it probably seems pretty overwhelming for you guys to be going through this process, all the stuff you're trying to learn and memorize. And I already know, you have real lives, you're probably working part-time, full-time, you've got kids, like most people getting into the industry. You know, you don't just have time to study 10 hours a day. So use this video to help streamline your guys' study process, and don't hesitate to lean into others like myself and the Axiom team. And obviously you guys are on YouTube, which is a great, you know, just a killer resource. But I say that because this is what we're working towards, right? This is what we're working towards. I promise it will be worth it. I was once upon a time in the same place as you know, sitting there studying from a book, and I didn't have all these resources, all these companies didn't exist on YouTube to help us along. So if I can do it, I promise you can do it, and it's 100% worth it to wake up, love what you're doing, get to work with people every day. There's nothing that can match that, and if you do it right, you do it right, you surround yourself with the right people, there's also a great lifestyle and a lot of money to be made in the process. But we'll save that for another video. So I appreciate you guys staying with me. Like the video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and I'll see you guys next time.